together technological advances, operational concepts, and so forth across very different alliances in very different regions. It's going to be even harder, I think, because the adversaries are very different this time in each region, even if some of the operational challenges are the same. I think alliances are going to be more important and in some ways more challenging because unlike the first and second offsets, the technologies we're talking about now reside primarily in the non-defense sectors and are much more dispersed across Europe and Asia, principally Western Europe and Japan, than in the first and second offset when we were talking about nuclear weapons and precision-guided munitions. So we're going to need to not only link up with our allies on doctrine and operations requirements, technology development, we're going to have our defense and technological industrial bases beyond the defense sector part of this effort. And in some places, I think Japan, for example, this will be hard, but it will even be hard in the U.S. And then the third difference, it seems to me, where allies will be important is that in the effort to shore up deterrence, as Secretary Carter says in the Asia-Pacific context, we're moving towards principled coalitions or principled federations. We have on the panel here the high-end allies represented. But a lot of the vulnerabilities we have in the so-called hybrid warfare or gray zone area are countries like the Philippines or new NATO members, where the capacity shortfalls are in some ways not that high tech. And so it raises the question about how we deal with a different hierarchy of requirements in addition to the different potential adversaries and the more differentiated and dispersed technological bases we're going to have to draw on. So it's always been about allies, the first, second, and now third offset. But this time it's even more critical, I would argue, that we get this right with the allies. And as far as I can see, and I'm primarily an Asia guy, our allies are pretty satisfied with the work that Secretary Carter, Secretary Warwick, and others are doing to start this dialogue, but some of the harder challenges are coming ahead. So with that as framing comments, I want to introduce the panel. To my right, Dr. Janine Davidson, the Undersecretary of the Navy, the 32nd Undersecretary of the Navy, a post with a very, very proud historic tradition, although the title changed slightly, including Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Theodore Roosevelt. Coolest office in the U.S. government, except it's now in the old executive office building. She has enormous responsibility overseeing the management of an annual budget in excess of $170 billion and responsibility for the training and well-being of 900,000 sailors and Marines. Next to Janine, we have from Norway the Minister of State for Defense, Øystein Boe, who served originally in the Norwegian Army and has had a distinguished career as an official in Norway working on foreign affairs and security. To his right, General Sir Gordon Messenger, Vice Chief of the Defense Staff in the UK Ministry of Defense, a Royal Marine with operational experience in Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And finally, next to him, my friend and colleague here at CSIS, the former National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Tony Abbott of Australia, Andrew Shearer, who served with great distinction in that capacity, not only for Tony Abbott, but for Prime Minister John Howard in the Ministry in DFAT, Foreign Affairs, and in Defense, and in the Embassy here in Washington for perspective from Australia. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us some opening comments. I want to follow up on some of the themes I introduced, if there's still room to do so, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So Janine, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having us here. Thanks for hosting. It's always fantastic to get out of the big five-sided building and talk to people thinking about big problems in big ways. And so thanks again for pulling us all together. It's great to be on a panel with you all as well and see you again. Let me just give a couple sort of framing ideas that we can pitch out for discussion. I want to start by absolutely reiterating what Mike says. Our partnerships and innovations have always been our asymmetric advantage as allies, coalitions, and the United States in general. It's this power of collective values that has made us as strong and has been sort of underwritten the peaceful cooperation that we have. I think it's absolutely important. Global stability is a team sport. It absolutely cannot be accomplished by any one actor, and not the United States and not anybody else. It takes partnerships, it takes innovation. And partnership and innovation is hard. It's as hard as it is essential. It takes persistent work and collective learning. I like to focus on shared concept developments as well as technologies. We do exercises and training. We have to do this consistently all the time. It's about interoperability, and interoperability is also really, really hard, as Mike sort of alluded to. You have partners on different levels. It requires everybody, if you really want to get to that sweet spot of interoperability, it requires everybody to be either equal or near equal in their level of technological development and sophistication, operational sophistication, across so many different areas: communications, logistics, planning, tactics, all kinds of strategy development, everything. But I think that we must move beyond just sharing information or trying to fight shoulder to shoulder. We really need to be in a sort of a seamless, integrated environment and mindset. And like I said, that takes a lot of work. The good news is, you know, no one thinks we shouldn't be doing this. So we are, and we're doing it in lots of different ways. And I just want to sort of throw out some examples of how today, as we think about the third offset and as I think about partnerships and the futures of our alliances, some of the things we're doing right now that I think are promising. We just finished up unmanned war game in Scotland with the UK, our partners. And this is, to me, the whole technological promise of unmanned systems is incredibly promising, but it has to be coupled with operational concepts as well. So we're going to have all kinds of, from the Navy perspective, on the surface, under the surface, in the air, unmanned systems. How is that going to change the way we fight? How is it going to change the way we operate as a team? And how can we take technologies that are coming from the commercial sector and also marry that up with some of the innovative thinking that we're doing in terms of how we're going to operate together? And I'll talk a little bit about concepts in a bit. Another great example of where we're innovating and where I think there's a lot of potential for partnership is in energy innovation. And you know this is one of Secretary Mavis's big initiatives. And I just want to say, you know, like the Marine Corps is leading the Mobile Elective Hybrid Power Sources Technology Assessment Cooperative with India. And people don't know about these things, but hybrid electric drives on ships, turns out, is a pretty amazing thing. I went out to the USS America. We have a hybrid electric drive. Now, this is some of the technology that the UK was already ahead of us on. It saves us massive amounts of fuel. But if you don't care about that, and some people don't, why is that important from an operational perspective? Because it allows us to stay out longer, allows us to be there, and we don't have to get back to refuel, which if you're in the Navy, that's one of the biggest time sucks and one of the most vulnerable parts of your deployment. This is a serious operational game changer if we get this right. At RIMPAC also we had the Rim of the Pacific exercise where we had 8 different partners there, including Australia, Canada, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Singapore, and South Korea, all experimented with steaming on biofuels. So these kinds of experimenting together to get to the next step is incredibly important. More obvious examples, of course, are the F-35. I mean, this is sort of game-changing, potentially game-changing technologies in this aircraft if we get the data sharing right. And this is another one of the challenges of interoperability. But even just the acquisition of it, 9 partner countries and other 3 countries buying these planes, this is an amazing opportunity. Another great example that we're in conversation about with the UK, in 2021, we'll be putting Marine Corps F-35s on the maiden voyage of the UK's Queen Elizabeth, working out the details on that. And again, devil's always in the details, but that is a fantastic opportunity to learn about this new technology together and to share concepts and to think about not just how to fly the plane, not just how to fly the plane on an aircraft carrier, but how to do it together and how to do it in context of other kinds of operational concept development that we're talking about in terms of sea control and maritime strategy in general. Piece of paper. some of the other, another really promising initiative last year, or 2014 actually, we launched the Kongsberg Naval Strike Missile off of, which is a Norwegian system, off of our LCS, USS Coronado. This is a great example of not just partnership, but also as we think about the potential of the LCS and how that fits into some of our concepts, incredibly important to bring lethality to that ship. And it's in the operational concepts where I find some of the most creative thinking, and where if we don't get the operational concepts right, the technology is just, you know, cool stuff that we're spending a lot of money on. One of the interesting concepts that we're talking about now in the U.S. Navy is distributed lethality. So what's distributed lethality? Instead of just, you know, carriers and surface ships fighting as a carrier strike group, we're going to distribute these ships. We're going to make them more lethal. We're going to change the calculus of the enemy. Okay, so the surface fleet's thinking about this a lot. Our Navy and Marine Corps are thinking about this a lot. But imagine if you expand that in a partner way, and you have exponentially more ships doing exponentially more lethal and distributed. This is where you start to find some game-changing ways of operating. Of course, the devil is in the details, because what makes distributed lethality work is interoperability among all the ships, and data transfer, and it's as promising as it is actually challenging when you start to think about the communications that are required. If you factor in something like NIFCA, I love these acronyms, right? Naval Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air. So this is a concept where you can leverage other assets in the air and elsewhere, so that you don't have to be the targeter. You can use others, so that it spans your reach. Again, if it's not just Americans with this capability, then you've completely changed your battle space. Of course, in all of these things, and those last two things in particular, the great promise is integration, and the great challenge is integration. And here is where I think we're often in our own way. And we're not necessarily in our own way the way I began this, which is to say some people are at this level of sophistication technologically, and some people are at this level. But we, especially in the United States, are in our own way from a policy perspective. We make it really hard. We make it really hard to share information with our partners. We sit here at this table together. We make it really hard to share technology. We make it really hard to sell stuff. And we have got to shorten those loops and figure this out, because that is, if it's partnerships in the integrated way that I've just described, which is going to be the game-changing thing, if we don't have the policies right in ways that allow us to do this, then it will just be, it will be a false promise. And so that's what we work on every day. And I look forward to expanding the discussion with our partners here.
Excellent, thank you. Mr. Minister?
I push this better. I also appreciate the opportunity to speak, and it's a subject of great importance, and I also wish to thank you for inviting me. The Norwegian MOD has a long-standing cooperation with the CSIS, and so this is a good event in that series. You mentioned the importance of allies and partner, and I believe, as you both of you said, that when discussing the third offset, it is important to keep in mind that allied security is inseparable from U.S. security. We often focus on how the U.S. provides for its allies, but the fact is that we are all committed to each other's security, and we all have to work together to make that as good as possible. For a small country like Norway is, of course, also dependent on the alliance and in an event of a crisis, of reinforcement and so on, but we definitely do not take the U.S. for granted. But still, and I'll return to that, burden sharing goes both ways. How we deal with the security challenges in the High North is one example of this. Norway has made considerable investments in military presence, readiness, surveillance, and in providing situational awareness. We, of course, do this primarily to meet national needs, but we also do it on behalf of NATO and on behalf and in support of the U.S. In many ways, sticking to that region, you can see us as the allied gatekeeper of the North, but we take as a small country great responsibility in this strategically important area. And when I say that your security concerns are our security concerns, I also, in broad terms, point to why the third offset strategy matters for Norway. There are many reasons why the allied dimension is important. I will focus my remarks on two main areas where allies may support the third offset strategy. Firstly, we can effectively support the strategy and the development of the concept through our insights into evolving threats and challenges to our security. Some of the development addressed in the third offset strategy are not only relevant to the US, they are felt and they are experienced by allies as well. Many European allies are in fact on the front lines just now. One example that I already touched on is Norway as a neighbor to Russia, and one of the very few allies that never dropped our focus on Russia after the Cold War, but maintained the knowledge and the activity to keep track on their activity. How we can see firsthand how Russia, through military modernization, has significantly increased its military capabilities. Key themes in this modernization efforts are improvements within command and control, mobility, network-centric warfare, modernization of the nuclear force, investment in the submarine force, and the introduction of long-range precision-guided strike missiles. And of course, of particular interest for Norway, but also for NATO and for the US, is how these capabilities are changing the strategic situation on NATO's northern maritime flank. The Russian bastion defense concept is back on the agenda when allies meet. And in this concept, Russia would forward deploy an established zone of control down to the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, which could include a capability to project force into the North Atlantic and disrupt the sea lines of communication across the Atlantic, with the effect that that would have. This is an example, to my mind, of the type of challenges that the third offset also can and should address. And this is also an example of how allies can provide the US decision makers with situational awareness, valuable insights, and into regional conditions, and also provide important perspective on current and future security trends and evolving weaponry. The second way in which the allied dimension is important is through direct support with skills and technologies. This, to my mind, has both a human and a technological dimension. More efficient collaboration and human-machine interface is a key component in the third offset strategy. For Norway, the assumption of having a woman or a man in the loop is extremely important. And I'm fully in line with Bob's work on this. This is not just a moral or ethical issue. And as Bob said this morning, it is also one of the primary assets of our and allied armed forces is our people. The skills, the competence, and the values and knowledge that our personnel bring with them from our open and free societies are crucial. In our case, we have a highly skilled and educated military force through our conscription service, which now applies to both women and men. We're able to recruit from the best and the brightest. That gives us a unique recruitment well for our professional forces. And we have a comprehensive education and schooling system that provides our military forces with the skills they need to operate in an increasingly complex battle space. So we shouldn't just solely focus on the technological aspects and on gadgets. The human factor is as important. As an alliance, I believe, as also Bob said, that we have a huge advantage in this area. But that human factor, of course, might also be challenged as robotics and autonomous technologies advance. But I believe maintaining the principle of the man in the loop will eventually be to our advantage. And then turning to technology and capabilities, there are definitely important areas where Norway can support the third offset. The Norwegian defense industry is small in relative terms, but it's also highly innovative. And in some niche areas, Norwegian companies deliver cutting-edge military technologies. This includes the Kongsberg Group. You mentioned the naval strike missile, or the Puffin, as Cole and Singer call it in the Ghost Fleet, and the Hugin autonomous underwater vehicles. It also includes companies like Nammo, who makes the rocket motors for the ESSM, the RST, and the AMRAAM missiles. We don't have the ambition of having a fully fledged national industry. We focus on areas where we have comparative advantages, and with a strong focus on quality, advanced technology, and not least continuity. I mentioned the Hugin, which is an unmanned underwater surface mine countermeasure system. We began working on this during the 1980s, and this is one of the first systems of its kind in the world. It fuses autonomy, robotics, and human-machine interface, and the result is a highly capable and advanced system exemplifying the highly relevant technologies that makes Norway a credible and relevant contributor to the third offset strategy. And then, of course, how do we get there? One important success criterion for the third offset is fostering a culture of innovation. In Norway, we have been able to do this by establishing close interaction between our armed forces as the users, the defense industry, and the defense R&D community. Given we have a small size and we have topographic and particular climatic challenges, we have had to do things smartly. We've had to think out of the box. As technology develops at an ever-increasing pace, our experience is that being small and lean can actually be an advantage. It makes us even more agile and adaptable, which is particularly important from a third offset perspective. Secretary Carter mentioned this morning mini satellites. We've been doing this for years. We've been putting up satellites that we thought would last this size, that we thought would last for 5 years, and they're still flying. So this is also an area where we have been doing good work. So in concluding, I believe strongly that allies have an important role to play in developing and implementing the third offset strategy. Allies have valuable insights into the nature of evolving threats, and I believe the US could usefully use its alliance relationship to promote and foster a common understanding and awareness of the threats and challenges. To me, this is an important starting point for the third offset strategy. And allies also have human skills, competency, capabilities, and the technologies that are relevant in realizing the third offset strategy. I think none of the allies, no nation actually can match the US in terms of sheer size and the defense technology of the defense technology sector. But we should nevertheless seek partnerships among allies that leverages each nation's comparative advantages. There's, of course, the question that I was also put in the other session. When technology is readily available and it works and is doing well but is not produced in the US, can the US in the longer term afford not making use of that technology and then start duplicating? Or would it be more wise to say, okay, we take that technology, we use it, and then we focus our resources on something else? I know this is a difficult issue. It's about industry and work and labor and all that, but still the question needs to be asked. The bottom line, and one thing, we of course have a huge problem in Europe with 19 different combat vehicles or something, so we also have a job to do. But the bottom line is that we face the same challenges and threats. No country, I believe, not even the US, can or should face these on its own. We are stronger together, and this holds true also for the third offset strategy. I think I'll end at that.
That was an excellent contribution. Thank you. General?
Thank you very much. Can I support the view of colleagues in thanking CIS and DoD for actually having an allies panel? I think in many ways that sends exactly the right message, and I'm grateful for the platform. We often think of alliances and allies through the political lens, through the sort of shared valued lens, through the capability lens. Given the challenges we face, I'm of the view that the different perspectives that one gets from being an alliance is, frankly, as important as any of those. If you want to really understand Russia, go to Norway, go to Finland, go to Estonia, go to Romania, go to Turkey, go to Vietnam, and you will get very, very different perspectives, the totality of which one is unable to get unless one takes those multiple reference points. So I am a strong believer that an alliance is a mutually dependent organization. There's been talk this morning about how allies are beneficiaries and recipients of US military power, and yes, we are. But it would be wrong of me to not say that we are also meaningful contributors in capability terms, in political value terms, and in bringing different perspectives. And that is absolutely true of the third offset. It's absolutely true of the broader innovation agenda that was the hallmark of the Defence Secretary's speech this morning. And we are entirely supportive of it. It goes exactly with the grain of our thinking, and we look to be meaningful and significant contributors to it. How will that manifest itself? Well, it will manifest itself in an ever deeper and modernized relationship between our country, between the US, and between key allies. And I think that the focus that the DoD has put on this really brings into sharp relief that sort of modernizing, innovative agenda, which is so important. And I think viewing existing relationships in that way is a really helpful, healthy development. So we are entirely supportive of it. We also have, and we collaborate. We collaborate at all levels of classification. We have unique capabilities, as other nations do, which we can bring to bear. And it's a very mature relationship that we have with the US, in that there's a recognition of that, everyone bringing something to the table, and a genuinely collegiate approach. We've also launched our own, says here, Lift Up pamphlet. We've also launched our own Defence Innovation Initiative, which is entirely consistent with many of the themes that Secretary Carter talked about this morning. It's different than the third offset in that it isn't viewing this through the lens of threats and pacing competitors, and we have framed it against a broader set of defence challenges that we all face. But nonetheless, there's some very serious consistency and linkages between the two. And we've posed ourselves 7 defence challenges, which I won't go through mostly because I can't remember them, but they do extend from influencing potential adversaries through to understanding and decision-making in the information age, all the way through to optimising our future workforce to ensure that it can adapt to how we see the future challenges that we'll face. It's not, and I think again the morning's talks brought this out, it is not just about technology. It's not just about, sexy gizzards. It is about the way we organize ourselves. It's about the way that we work. It's about our behaviors. It's about our commercial structures. It's about changing a culture whereby those who have innovative ideas feel able to bring them to the table. It's a culture where failure is an option, because if you're at the cutting edge of innovation, you have to be prepared for a few blind alleys. It's not just about the UK military. We are very serious about engaging academia, think tanks, and critically, the commercial sector in it, because we're, as you already know, in certain sectors in a world where the commercial world is ahead of governments in the pace at which it can bring in change. And we're also looking at changing our processes. In an era where we are consistently looking at the evergreen nature of what we're trying to do, where open architectures are at the heart of this so that we can build in stride capabilities and keep up with the pace of technology, our approvals processes don't quite match that. We tend to approve for big chunks of capability that are going to last for decades and are costed as such. Well, if we're in this sort of constantly adapting, innovative, growing capability world, then perhaps we need to think about how we approve the money that we invest in capabilities. Why are we doing it? Why are we producing this as a country and putting so much stock behind it? Well, not because we should, but because we must. And I think there are three big driving areas as to why innovation is so important. We need to innovate to deter, we need to innovate to afford, and we need to innovate to deliver a workforce that is fit for purpose. Innovate to deter. As mentioned this morning, innovation is essentially at its heart about deterrence. It's about keeping ahead of pacing competitors. I am not clear that we have fully modernized our deterrence thinking in light of that fact, and I am, whilst deterrence is enjoying renewed prominence as an issue, I'm not sure that our thinking has yet caught up collectively in that. Modern deterrence needs to take account of what technologies they are and the pace at which they can adapt. Modern deterrence needs to take place of cyber and our ability to act in the virtual domain. It needs to take into the account that that domain, by its very nature, blurs the distinction between peace and war. And that hybrid is not necessarily about little green men in eastern Ukraine. It is about this constant competitive environment in the virtual domain. And that is stretching our legal and policy bases. We're not used to that. We have a set of laws and policies for peace, and we have a set of laws and policies for war. We like the distinction between the two. I'm not sure we can sustain that. We need to modernize our nuclear deterrence thinking. We need to recognize that our resilience, our inability to be affected, our ability to keep going despite being degraded, is at the heart of the deterrent effect that that emanates from us. That is, yes, military, but it also goes all the way back to our industrial base and the resilience within our industrial bases, and some hard questions over sovereign capabilities and the degree to which the industrial base is internationalized in a way that makes that difficult to view in the way that we used to. I think modern deterrence also needs to take note of both the opportunities of consensus-based ally organizations and the relative disadvantages of those in terms of speed of decision-making. And it also needs to take into account what was described by the Estonian president in a speech that I was at recently as messaging in the post-truth era. His contention was that truth is no longer sufficient to counter a lie. It was interesting when I saw that screen of the MH17 attributions, and the point was made that if we had all those facts to hand, then that would have been a really effective and strong message, which would have won the information contest that surrounded that particular incident. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that you could stack up such certainties and achieve a victory in that anymore. The post-truth era, which I thought was an interesting, and I'll claim it as my own, but it was the president of Estonia who said it. And we mustn't forget in this the role of NATO. Now, many of you will have worked with NATO. I am a huge fan of NATO. I've worked within NATO occasionally, and I've worked with NATO all my military career. And it can be a frustrating organisation in which to get a sort of modernising debate that takes into account some of these contemporary issues that I've described. But it can happen. It can happen more slowly than perhaps we'd like, but it can happen. And my only point would be that we can only achieve that conversation if we're within it. The idea of being outside it and trying to encourage it is one that I dismiss. So accept the frustration that comes with it. And don't just think through the relevance of NATO in a European and North Atlantic context. I recognise the geographical specificity of that organisation, but some of the goodness that comes from that, by dint of being the most successful political and military alliance that we've ever had, has repercussions and implications globally and to the benefit of like-minded nations. The second reason we need to innovate is to innovate to afford. And I think that we have yet to really come to grips with the fact that we are constructing our future force design to deal with two divergent challenges. On the one hand, let's call it upstream, dispersed, tackling instability that is essentially born of inequality and poor governance. And on the other, dealing with the rise of peer and near-peer adversaries. Now, the challenge is that those are two very different problem sets, but actually the capability overlap between the two is not as tidy as we would like. And there is a temptation, is there not, to design two forces, one to deal with the former, which is dispersed, ubiquitous, the other to deal with the, and with less survivable requirements, and then the other, which is to do with mass, concentration of force, high levels of survivability. I just don't think we can afford to have two different forces. We, in our military, certainly cannot, but we need to accept that there is an affordability challenge to do that. And there's also an affordability challenge in the fact that the investment required to deliver exquisite capabilities is at a relative disadvantage to that investment that is required to deliver counter capabilities to those exquisite capabilities. And we will always be encountering that. So getting our future defence design to be affordable has to be a major objective of the innovation agenda, and what we and the amount of priority that we accord that. You know, we need to accept that affordability starts to become part of power politics, that we should be looking to impose cost on our competitors by making our systems as difficult to attack as they can be. We also need to exploit technology that makes our capabilities as affordable as they can be, and use innovation money to do that, use that as a focus. We need to try and get this overlap between capabilities as best we can, so the same pieces of equipment, the same types of people can deal with both those divergent challenges. We need to try and take the trick of cheap, ubiquitous platforms in large numbers, but in doing so, not compromise our ability to deliver high-end capabilities. As shown by the SCO talk, we need to retain the ability to surprise by adapting existing capabilities. The third and final, and then I'll stop, is to innovate, to populate, to deliver a workforce. In our country, and I don't think we're alone, the greatest risk we have to deliver modern, joint, integrated capabilities into the 2020s is our ability to find, recruit, and retain the right sorts of people with the right sorts of skills. And if we just plough on in a pursuit of high-end technology that demands higher and higher skills quotients for our people, we will end up with the least used, most admired museum in the world. So innovation is utterly central to the challenge. We need to use innovation to deliver capabilities that lower the skills requirement in our future force. That can be done. It is not counterintuitive. We need to have innovative methods of attracting the right sorts of people. And a number of us have got initiatives underway. And we need to recognize that by dint of simply having a modern, innovative mindset, that in its own right is going to go some way in attracting the sorts of people who will find that attractive. They'll find it a good career proposition. They'll find themselves at the heart of thinking about modern capabilities in the modern age. And that really is an important message if we're to get the right sorts of people. So that was it. From a UK perspective, utterly bought into this idea that innovation is central if we are to keep ahead of our competitors. Keeping ahead of your competitors is utterly central to deterrence and the avoidance of war. But don't let us get utterly focused on that as for innovation. This is about making us more affordable and properly populated as well. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. We'll, I think, want to come back to some of the tensions and contradictions you've highlighted. Andrew?
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here. Privileged to follow 3 terrific presentations, and of course the disadvantage of going last is that all the good things to say have been said already, but having been around politics a little while now, your message isn't really cutting through until it's been repeated so often that people are sick of it. So you might hear a little bit of overlap in what I have to say. I'm conscious too that I'm the only non-government speaker on the panel, so perhaps I can introduce a few kind of notes of dissonance and a little bit of grit in the oyster today. My starting point really is that, you know, while I'm a fully paid up alliance guy, I think we all have to acknowledge that today's alliances are under a lot of strain. You know, threats are rising, resources are constrained in all of the allied countries, I think it's fair to say, and we've even been going through a period where alliances have been fundamentally questioned in a US presidential election campaign, which is certainly something new for me and I think new for most of us. While I endorse all of the very positive things we've heard today, I do want to just underline how challenging I think this is. From the perspective of America's allies, I think, you know, really what we're looking for above all is an element of certainty and some engagement, and certainly there'll be very close interest, I know, in the extent to which the next incoming administration maintains continuity around the third offset, and, you know, I'm fairly confident it will, but I think that's a very important question. And in Asia, I guess the region that Australia worries about most directly anyway, you know, we're very acutely focused on the rapidity with which the conventional military balance is shifting against the United States and its allies, and for that reason I think, you know, I can't speak officially. Commodore Pete Levy, Australia's naval attaché, is here, he can back me up hopefully. You know, Australia does very strongly join the other allies in supporting the third offset. And I think if you look at our 2016 Defence White Paper, you can see some very strong sort of parallels and reinforcement for the thrust of the third offset there. Properly developed and implemented and presented, I think the third offset strategy can make a crucial contribution to reinforcing deterrence and reassuring US allies as well. But I think it's also fair to say that there's a fair bit of work to do, which is why I think this conference is very timely. There is some scepticism out there. I'm just back from Canberra and I did the rounds as you usually do, and I think there is a little bit of scepticism out there. And I think there's also, to be frank, limited knowledge about the third offset still. And again, you know, the administration I think has been doing a good job of sort of raising the profile and getting the word out, and this conference hopefully will be part of that. And I think the other thing that allies have to acknowledge, and it's been said already by my colleagues, but this is a two-way street, and President Obama, when he spoke in that Atlantic interview about free riders, you know, frankly, he has a point, and you could almost sort of detect off the page his frustration. And I think all of us need to recognise that America's expectations of its allies are going to rise in the coming years, and we are going to have to respond to that, and that will be challenging for America's allies. I think it's also true that the scale and nature of the threats we face, whether it's in the Asia Pacific or elsewhere, means that interoperability is going to become more and more critical. And again, I'm kind of preaching to the choir and repeating what's been said. Early involvement, it seems to me, of allies across all the levels of the system is going to be fundamental here. And I think we tend to just think about, military connectivity and the dialogue between defence ministries. But, if I had a message for the administration, I think it would be, we've got to be talking at this at the political level, we've got to be talking at the policy level, we've got to be talking at the level of operations and doctrine and concepts. And we've got to be talking, the point that Mike made, I thought, very well at the start, we've got to be talking at the industrial level and even in our academic communities, because this technology is going to be so diverse, and we've got to tap as many sources of it as possible. So what we need, it seems to me, is a robust, collaborative framework that embraces all of those different levels among the allies, and I think the administration's made a start in putting that in place, but it's not always the case that allies are built into US thinking at the start. Sometimes there's a little bit of a sense that allies are a kind of add-on, and it's only by building allies in from the start that I think you can get the clarity around goals and ways and means that underpins good strategy, and also that we can come up with the best division of effort among the allies and the US. And I think this is a really fundamental point. Allies obviously are going to play in this in different ways. They bring different strengths to the table, and if we have this strong framework, I think we can best let allies play to their strengths. Australia and the UK, I think, are very close allies, obviously, and are at the heart of thinking about the third offset. Other allies are closely involved. I'd make a little shout out for Japan here. I think Japan needs to be perhaps engaged a little more. When you look at the degree of integration between US and Japanese military forces in the undersea realm in particular, but also in missile defence, air defence, ISR, etc., I think we all need to be thinking about how to integrate Japan much more tightly into this, perhaps under the trilateral strategic dialogue. There'd be scope for a working group. Because when you think about parts of the third offset, we were talking about energy technology earlier. Japan's a world leader there, robotics, etc. Anyway, enough. That's my brief for Japan. I think the other thing, to put a little bit of a dead cat on the table, we do have to resolve the remaining impediments to technology transfer. I've been working on the Alliance for the best part of 20 years now, and it still mystifies me a little. The F-35 came up before, that we have to go around the same boys again and again and again to argue why the best possible technology should be released to America's closest allies. And personally, I think we need to get to a sort of almost invert the paradigm. I mean, of course, there are going to be some very sensitive technologies, but let's start from the basis that everything's releasable, and then let's chisel it right down so that you have the broadest possible set of capabilities. Again, I suspect there'd be a lot of sympathy in this room for that proposition, and I know it's something that Janine and her colleagues put a huge amount of effort into, and that is appreciated by your allies. So I'll kind of wrap up just with a few thoughts about, what are the keys from an allied perspective going forward, because I know people want to get into the discussion. I think fundamentally the third offset has to be seen as credible and effective, and that's the only way that it's going to generate the necessary sort of deterrent effect and reassure allies. Almost equally important, though, it's got to be seen to be sustainable, whether in terms of political support or funding, or even, conceptually, so that your allies have a clear sense of where you're going and that you're committed to staying on that road. Because at the end of the day, these investments are incredibly expensive for all of us. It's got to be accessible, it's got to be by your allies, it's got to be interoperable with your allies. We've talked about that. And my last point, I really think it has to be even more urgent. I know the administration's put a massive amount of effort into this, but in whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Europe, or whether it's in the Middle East, the military balance is changing very quickly, and I think Janine made the point about sort of smashing down the decision-making cycles. Our adversaries are actually inside our OODA loop, and we need to do better in that regard. I'll leave it there.
Terrific. Thank you, Andrew. I want to ask one or two devil's advocate questions to the panel to help sharpen the focus, and then we'll open it up to the expert audience we have. I mean, I hear some common themes. Obviously, one, given the title of the panel, one I firmly believe in is that allies are critical, interoperability is critical, and that's right. I think a common theme is that the purpose of this endeavor is to complicate potential adversaries' planning, all the way from the kind of gray zone. In the Asia world, we call it gray zone. In the Europe world, it tends to be called hybrid warfare, but this phase zero effort to change the geopolitical facts on the ground through, short of war or in non-kinetic ways. We need to complicate planning from that level right up to the high-end warfighting planning that an adversary might do. And that's a common theme. And the openness and inclusivity of the way people are talking about the third offset today is advantageous because coalitions, interoperability, collective security, which we have in Europe and potentially could have in Asia, all of these complicate the geopolitical goals of potential adversaries in significant ways, dissuade coercion and deter war, and the ability to tap into technologies across our industrial bases and develop innovative and even surprising doctrines and operations complicates at the high end. So the open kind of inclusive architecture that we've heard today has huge advantages. However, this is my question for you. If it's about everything, is it really about anything? Shouldn't we just recognize we're broadly talking about coalition building, interoperability, and then break this into pieces? One piece would be the third offset, which would be developing what General Messenger said as part of his discussion, high-end survivable systems and subsystems that can operate inside the A2AD environment, the area where our adversaries have used the second offset, precision-guided munitions, to make our forward presence advantage a vulnerability, and just focus on that. And then we're talking about Britain, Canada, Norway, some NATO countries, Japan possibly, Australia, and just keep it simple, stupid, and focus on innovative technologies there. And then break out capacity building for other allies and partners who are vulnerable, which will help us in the gray zone. I'm still not sure, and I'm not sure anyone is, whether cyber is in or out of the third offset, but cyber would be separate. And the nuclear, which I understand, Janine, correct me if I'm wrong, is not part of the third offset, but if you talk to Japanese officials with the North Korean nuclear developments, or Korean officials, they think that's the most important thing we need to offset. So maybe just, my question for you is, why don't we just focus on these core technologies, concepts, operations at the high end so they're war-winning, and then have separate efforts instead of risking everything becoming related to nothing, to everything, by having such an open, inclusive architecture. Now, I'm not sure I believe what I'm saying, but I want to put it on the table because it occurred to me listening to you. You want to go first? Maybe not, but you go first.
Crack at it, yeah. Well, I might fight your scenario a little bit. I don't know that the third offset is so much about everything that it's about nothing. I actually think that this is the conundrum, right? Is that all the things that you mentioned are actually integrated, right? I mean, you can't just not think about cyber and just think about this A2AD threat without also thinking about concepts of operation and how you're going to integrate, right? Because they all go together. And like I said in my remarks, you can build technologies, but you're just going to graft them on the way you're already operating if you're not also thinking creatively in the conceptual phases. And so, in fact, one of the things I'm trying to do inside The Navy, and I'm sure we can broaden it out, is to bring those communities together. Even inside the Navy, which is a ginormous enterprise, we have people looking at unmanned systems, for instance, you know, in the acquisition world, you know, talking to industry, thinking about the technologies, and they are completely sort of isolated from, you know, the people that are thinking about all these sexy new kinds of concepts like distributed lethality and things like that. And so I'm actively trying to bring them together because, yeah, it is about everything, but only if it's integrated together.
Okay. The argument's still standing. It's wobbly, but it's still standing. Maybe Øystein can knock it down.
I'm not so sure that it's about, I mean, you speak about the top tier allies and technology. I think it's much more than that. And as we're hearing, you know, it's about operating better together. It's about how we're organized. Hybrid is a good example. Hybrid, as the general said, is not just kind of green men without distinctions. Hybrid is a different way of doing things. And hybrid needs a high involvement of human brain to counter. I think there is a role for all allies and for all partners out there in having a broad perspective of the third offset. It's, as was said by Bob and also by General, it's about how we operate together. It's about how we are getting more out of our resources and how we can work together to have the right resources.
Thanks.
I mean, I think that the common theme is that this is about getting ahead of your competitors, and that automatically takes you into high end. And I'm sure that is the right direction of travel for an initiative such as this. I mean, I think, though, that there is a concern that becomes an undue focus. Firstly, we have to accept that the sorts of threats that we have been dealing with are the less severe, more likely end of the market, and to commit, you know, our entire intellectual horsepower and innovative effort into the less likely, more severe bracket could skew. I also worry a little that we lose one of the greatest lessons of the last 20, 30 years, which is about human behaviors, human engagement, the cognitive element of operations and warfare matter. And to portray this as, you know, automatons, you know, human machine interfaces in competition against peer or near peer. To my mind, any confrontation with a peer, near peer competitor or adversary has the human dynamic, the population dynamic, the cognitive dynamic as strongly as ever. And I worry that we focus on that alone.
Yeah, I go back to, I guess, the concept of an offset strategy. You have an offset strategy to offset an area where your adversary has a sort of disproportionate advantage. And when I think about the threats that we're dealing with, I think about kind of two key areas that, to me, it seems the third offset should embrace, and I think it is. The first is the sort of peer competitor anti-access challenge that we see in the Western Pacific and, you know, Persian Gulf and I guess bits of the Baltic and so forth. And then the second one is this slightly different challenge, which is around, you know, hybrid deniable operations. You know, it's got a sort of, and sorry, I should put nuclear as a third category perhaps, but in this second category, it's in a way the hardest to deal with, I think, this sort of murky use of proxies, cyber's got a role in it, etc. So conceptually, I think, you know, those are the areas where our adversaries in some regards have some overmatch at the moment, and the whole point of the strategy is to neutralise their overmatch, and therefore it should embrace those things.
I'm going to out Janine a little. We were just whispering, and we were listening with the other ear about nuclear. Is nuclear in or out? And you know, the Russians and Chinese don't make that distinction. So it's something we need to think about. Andrew, can I just follow up with you, and others on the panel can comment, and then I'll open it up. I was at a discussion of the third offset this summer, it was primarily happening in the context of the Asia-Pacific, the neighborhood I inhabit. And a lot of people are saying, why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about third offset, was, as General Messenger said, gears towards the high-end, war-winning capabilities? Why are we talking about that when our potential peer competitor is also our, one of our major economic and financial partners and not an enemy? This is a devil's advocate question too, should we be talking about this so much? Is it necessary for reassurance to mobilize bureaucracies? Is there a risk to it, or do you think it's appropriate? And this is more about China. I think in the Russian case, or Iran, or others, less so.
Well, the messaging has to be nuanced, but my own view is that we live in a competitive world, and if you look at the suite of policies that have been in place, particularly in terms of responses to China's assertiveness of the last few years, I think we all have to acknowledge that those policy settings haven't worked, and that China is pursuing this sort of incremental strategy, so far everything going to plan, as it were. And therefore, I think we are needing to change our mindset, and we need to get our heads more into a deterrent mindset. Deterrence is psychological, and there's no point in having capabilities from a deterrence point of view unless you advertise them.
It was a setup question. I agree with you. Okay, we have a little bit of time for questions. If you'd raise your hand, identify yourself, keep it short. Professor?
I committed the alliance critical sins of the morning, but I'll stay away from those. I'm interested in the concept of anti-access and area denial. Now, it's been my observation that combining these two things together has an element, it introduces an element of confusion about the problem, especially about how you get around it and what the magnitudes are. Now, I'd be interested in listening to each member of the panel say something about how these two problems might be different and how allies in particular might contribute better to one or the other.
Thank you. To be fair to the panel, I think I'm the only one who said anti-access area denial, so feel free to throw me under the bus now when you answer Professor Posen's question. Jenny?
I'm just going to, because we don't have a lot. I think I agree with you. It's sort of in the Chief of Naval Operations, John Richardson, has just outlawed the term anti-access area denial in an article a couple weeks ago, because he says, it doesn't help us get our head around the problem. It doesn't actually describe what it is we're trying to do. So.
Actually, we still use that word, but you asked how do we get around it. I would ask how do we prevent it from happening, and that's what also the general was into. This is about deterrence. This is about organizing and making the right moves in order to prevent those things from happening. So that's in my mind how the third offset strategies and other strategies could help against that. We have to make sure that if someone should think of that idea, that would hurt so much that it would think twice.
So I agree with you. It's started to become a little bit of a cheap throwaway term. And the trouble with cheap throwaway terms is that everyone views them in slightly different ways, and we don't really get into analysing what we're talking about. I think your point, though, was about that anti-access is a different thing than aerial denial.
Maybe the alliances could play a bigger role in one problem than the other.
Yeah, and I mean, two points. Firstly, that really depends on what area you are trying to deny. Is the aerial denial piece of a deployment of a SAM system into Kaliningrad denying you access to a NATO partner? Or is it denying you access to Russian territory? I mean, those are two very different things. I think we often tend to view things in the former rather than the latter. I think the other piece of this is the cognitive element, the decision-making, that merely the positioning of a capability is in its own right, not A to AD. It is a combination of the positioning of a capability with the intent to use it that is the true A to AD capability. And we risk being affected, and our behaviours being affected merely by the physical move of a capability into a particular place, rather than really assessing, the risk assessing the degree to which it should affect our behaviours. So that sophistication does exist, it does go on, but I would support your thesis that it is currently being viewed oversimplistically.
Just quickly from a Pacific perspective, if I may, when you think about US grand strategy in Asia over, more than half a century, it's been based on free trade and open markets, open economic models, values and democracy, and America's ability to project power in the Western Pacific. China's strategy, it seems to me, is to start rolling back that ability in terms of projecting power and therefore unravel that construct, weakening alliances, splitting off regional countries and ultimately carving out a regional sphere of power, which, by the way, some people think would be a good outcome to all this. That's not the mainstream view in Australia. The mainstream view in Australia is it's very important to our national interests, our security, that the United States can continue to project power into the Western Pacific. And from my point of view, third offset needs to be all about finding solutions to that problem.
Your question, which was a very good one, also I think spotlights the different. As I was saying earlier before you came in, Barry, that our allies in different parts of the world face very different adversaries. This is not like the first and second offsets. We're talking about essentially the same adversary, and the geography is different. That's also potentially an enormous advantage, as the minister said, because Norway knows the northern approach. Japan knows the offshore archipelago. And a third offset strategy or technology and doctrinal effort that takes advantages of those unique geographic positions can be a ticket to success, actually. If the Arctic as well. Norway owns a couple of these.
I don't want to move into semantics on the different expressions, but if you look at what I described, the bastion defense, that would be an anti-access strategy to prevent other forces from getting into and close to the strategic assets around the Kola Peninsula, and it would be an area denial strategy to prevent reinforcement from coming to Europe. So it actually both of them.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. Andrew, are you in charge? No, good. Okay, we'll do one more question then on allies in the panel. Yeah, please.
Mike, my name is Mitsuo Nakai, Reagan Foundation. How is Japan doing in the Pacific Asia in terms of cybersecurity and also North Korea nuclear crisis and so forth?
Well, I'll try to answer that one unless. Yeah. Japan is very conscious of the cyber threat, of course. It's been attacked by all the same adversaries who've attacked us in the private sector and in government. Japan's cyber security capability is rather limited. You could probably fill this conference room with all the people doing cyber in the Japanese government right now. So there's a lot of catch-up that's necessary. Of course, historically, Japan's government and industry has been quite stovepiped. Part of the success of Japan is that competition among different industrial groupings and ministries. But there, I think, the fact we've had a prime minister now for several years in place, Prime Minister Abe, who's likely to be in place for several years more, and who has created a quite effective National Security Council, is a real opportunity to begin quickly catching up on these. In the context of third offset, my sense is that the Japanese government is quite keen to be in this. They see all the challenges and all the problems. As I said, I think in Japan, nuclear is a piece that's not, as I understand it, in the third offset as it's articulated by the department, which is a serious problem right now because of North Korea. And then the last thing I'd say is Japan, if we're talking about artificial intelligence and human-machine interface, Japan has enormous technological contributions to make. The problem is none of it's in the defense sector of the economy, and the civilian sector of the economy has stayed away from defense. So it's sort of a bigger opportunity and a bigger challenge than we face in the US or UK or Australia, but the same set of problems that several people have mentioned. How do you reach out to, how do you organize this in the way that the innovative sectors of the economy, in our case it would be Silicon Valley, are part of this effort? There are small experiments, I understand, to do this that have been successful on a small scale. I think not just in the US, but Japan and elsewhere, that's going to be one of the big challenges. I think we will end here. This has been a really terrific panel. And we've done NATO, we've done the Pacific. I think we've highlighted the opportunities. I sense we've unearthed an awful lot of challenges too. Several of the commentators said this third offset we're not doing because we want to or should do it, but because we have to do it. A number of people in the private sector have asked me, well, is this going to continue? The name might change, but I think this challenge is going to continue driving the common themes you hear across these alliances that span the globe. So it was a terrific panel. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for sitting this through with us.